I love it. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Road to 2000. As always, my name is Caleb Denby, and I will be your driver on this journey. Tonight, as the YouTube title says, I'm going over some of the worst games I've played in recent memory. Thankfully, I've had pretty good results in recent memory, so my worst games, even though they do look bad when you dig into the actual moves, the results haven't quite been as bad. But to live up to the title, I want to look at this game that I recently played against the one and only Julian Proleiko, St. Louis native, in the recent Master Lab tournament, which I already briefly covered some of the games from. So this was my only loss from the tournament, and it was the kind of loss where immediately after you play it, you're like, oh, that was just dumb. There's not much to learn from here. But as always, there's almost always something to learn from in your games. And so I want to talk tonight about how to look at games that are somewhat painful, games that you feel like you lost for a dumb reason, and how to still find something to learn from them. So this is it. You guys get to see me at my worst here tonight. Let's take a look. So Julian played 1e4, and Julian's the kind of guy who, depending on who he's playing, will mix things up. He plays all three of these moves now, and I really had no idea what he had prepped for me, so I was planning just to play my repertoire and face the challenges as they came. So I normally play the Caro-Kann. So I start with c6. We get d4, d5. He chooses knight to d2. I'm going for the quote-unquote classical variations, which happen after d take e4, knight take e4, bishop f5, knight g3, and bishop g6. So who can tell me the normal ideas of this particular opening line? Why has black done the things that black has done? Why has white done the things that white has done? What's the point of it all? Yeah, Brian?
I mean, black wants to activate the white's version.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it'll be a problem. And then white was just going for center control. And I know now, like white usually will push the H pawn
Yeah.
as a threat, and then castle queenside eventually.
Absolutely. So the idea of the Caro-Kann, it's actually a very ambitious opening, is that we are not content to play like French players and sort of hole up, leave our bishop on c8. We want to immediately get this bishop outside of the pawn chain where it can be active and it can sort of counter the opponent's bishop. But in order to do this, we do have to give something back. Chess is a game of give and take. So of course in the Caro-Kann, the thing that we have to give back is number one, this little bit of central space. White has this pawn in the center. We're not going to be able to challenge it for a little while. And number two, the bishop, although it's active outside the pawn chain, as always in the opening, if you bring your bishops out too early, they can sort of fall victim to the opponent's pieces. They're a little bit vulnerable, easy to attack. They're long-range pieces. And so, for example, the bishop on c1 is already doing a great job on c1. But when they sort of come near the enemy pieces, they oftentimes will be pushed around. And this is why the main move here is actually h4. This bishop is close to getting trapped on g6. If I pretend nothing's going on, it will get trapped. And so normal opening lines will go something like this. White gains some time against this bishop, uses that time to gain this kingside space. And there's a number of ways that the game can go, but oftentimes white tries to castle queenside, push the g-pawn, sort of attack on the kingside. These are the normal plans. So here we are. I'm comfortably aware of the normal ideas, as is Julian. And he chooses to play this move, knight g1, knight 1 to e2. Which is a move I've seen before. It's got a slightly different idea. Actually, it's a similar idea, but a slightly different way of going about it. Rather than leading with h4, h5, white is trying to put this knight on f4, challenge this bishop with the knight, and maybe then follow up with this move h4. So I always play this move e6 in response. We see knight f4, and now bishop d6. And here, the only moves I was really familiar with were, I think, c3, or h4, both of which are just sort of more well-known opening lines. The idea of h4 now, with the knight on f4, is that obviously what's going to happen if we try to do the same thing and play h6? White has an extra option here that sort of just blows up black's position. Yeah, Brian?
My immediate thought is just to take the bishop.
Yeah.
Now you have to capture that point.
You just take the bishop. This is the whole point of white's opening, is that now h4 is the threat, and you cannot respond to that threat with h6. So this is the idea for white, and I already knew the antidote. I like to think I know something about the Caro-Kann. So in response to h4, black can play this nice move, queen to c7. And the point now is that if you come after my bishop, you are actually leaving your knight behind. And I'm not sure the exact correct way to do things. I suspect you should take here and then take on f4. So you get the piece back and a pawn as well if white were to go for something like this. And the idea of c3 is to combat this with something like queen f3. And then after we continue developing, believe it or not, in this sort of crazy line after h5, black is going to play this move bishop c2 because it's the only safe square on the board, but it does turn out to be a safe square. So things can get pretty crazy. Instead, Julian played a move that I was not familiar with, which was knight g to h5. And Julian, very well-prepared guy, works hard on chess and knows my repertoire very well. So he's able to find a hole in my repertoire. He succeeds in winning the opening battle in that sense. So the question is now, what do you do? You've been surprised in the opening. You haven't seen this move, knight g to h5 yet. How do you approach this in your games? So take a second, look at this position in particular, see if you can come up with some options, and then I'll talk a little bit about the thought process. So obviously, just to get you started, white is making a threat. So we've got a problem to solve. Hello, hello. Welcome. Thanks for joining. So do any candidate moves spring to mind after seeing this move, knight g h5? So the good news is I know I'm not busted here. Hi, come on in. Just grab a seat. The good news is I know I'm not busted here because I know my openings well enough to know that okay, I haven't really done anything wrong. I should be okay. What do you think, Brian?
Just play bishop f8.
Bishop back to f8? Yeah, so no.
Okay.
Just you can sort of, outside of chess, you can kind of do some logic here and realize that bishop f8 is just never going to be the move. And the reason for that is in this position, if I have a better move than bishop d6, then I'm going to want to play that. And so here, if I go bishop f8 and white does anything else, my best move is still going to, I'm going to need to develop this bishop at some point. I can't leave this bishop on f8 forever. And something like h4, knight f6, knight g3, we've actually now transposed to what would have happened here. So it's like I can't really bring this bishop back because I know that then I'll end up playing an inferior move and at best transposing. Maybe bad things happen to me as well after bishop back to f8. Maybe white can do something else. But I think the simple move h4 is already enough when, again, I don't see anything besides something like knight f6. I would just be transposing to a worse line. But you've got the right idea. We need to do something about g7, obviously. So there's really only 3 options that I was able to come up with here. So yeah, move the king, king f8. That is absolutely one of the options I came up with. By the way, did anybody consider this move knight to f6? Sort of a tricky move. Nobody? Yes? Not yet? OK, so knight f6 is actually really desirable because if the knight cannot, or if the knight takes on g7, maybe I go king f8, and you've sort of got a problem with your knight being stuck on the side of the board. And who sees the idea in this position? If I actually could get this, then this would be amazing. I just win here.
Bishop takes f4.
Yeah, so it'd be nice to remove the defender, but unfortunately, white can also capture with the knight and remove that from danger as well. But this one's a little bit simpler. Yeah, Brian?
Take the h knight and then check with the queen.
Yeah, this is simply a double attack. It's a pretty long-range double attack, but it does work out. Whoops, spoilers. You didn't see anything. So we're here. Now, obviously, knight f6 has a problem, and that problem is that white has a much better move after king f8 here than knight h5, and that's just very unfortunate for me. So one more tactic for you guys to find. Go ahead and just shout it out if you see it. Yeah, either knight takes on e6, and when I take back, it gets replaced by the other knight, and I lose a queen. So unfortunately for me, knight f6 is no good, which leaves me really with king f8 as an option, or capturing one of the knights is the only other thing I can really do. So the bad news for me, I got surprised in the opening. King f8 definitely looks a little bit risky if you don't know what you're doing, right? You give up castling rights, your king gets stuck in potentially the center. You're going to have to work hard to develop your rook on h8. So not really what I want to do. Yeah, do you have something?
Like bishop over knight.
Yeah, so which bishop and which knight?
F4.
This one? Yeah, so I wasn't really in love with this one, to be honest, because in the Caro-Kann, like I said, it's great to get this bishop outside the pawn chain, but it is also going to be vulnerable here. So after bishop f4, knight f4, black is actually going to have a lot of the same problems as before. h4, h5 is still sort of coming, and bishop is just not so comfortable here. So for that reason, I ended up capturing on h5. White takes back with the knight, and now I am able to play this move g6. In this instance, you actually cannot go knight g7 because king f8 would win the knight. You no longer have this knight takes e6 garbage because your other knight is now missing. So I kept it simple, and I think that's important to do. So far, I really don't mind how I played this game at all. You want to keep things simple. When you get surprised in the opening, you want to stick with good, solid moves, and that's what I did. So Julian retreats the knight back to f4. I develop out now with knight to e7, which looks a little bit odd. It might make sense to go to f6, and I think knight f6 is fine. But my idea was simply that I wanted to put a little bit of pressure on this d pawn while I developed. White played g3. I went knight f5, bishop g2. And then what do you think about the move castles here? Good idea or bad idea? These are all the subtle little decisions that get made in the opening. Yeah, so in the opening, white has sort of provoked some weaknesses over here, right? So you do just have to be a little bit careful, as you were saying. Now, I don't think white's going to sacrifice right away, but these are definitely ideas you have to keep in mind. But really, there is one plan in particular that just looks sort of very, very frightening for black to deal with here. And specifically, I think it's so frightening because white hasn't castled yet, so we might get into some danger. So I've talked about this in a lot of previous lectures, but whenever one of the pawns in front of your king gets disturbed and has to move, it often creates what I like to call a hook, or not just me, a lot of people call it a hook. So why is it called a hook? Well, it's something that white can latch onto to open files and open up lines, files or diagonals into your king's position. So g6 is going to act as a hook here, and white can latch onto it somehow. So with that in mind, what move do you think might happen? Yeah, of course, h4. Specifically because this rook is still on h1. White hasn't committed to castling yet. And h5 is going to be a very, very serious threat. If I just ignore this and I allow h5 to happen, of course, I'm going to be running into some big threats here. I might have to try something like g5, which is not really something I'm interested in doing. If I continue ignoring things, play a semi-defensive move like queen f6, takes, and I have a lot to be worried about coming down the h file. I might not be losing right away, but it's certainly not going to be very, very comfortable for me with these pieces sort of looming. I mean, you know, maybe white has to take some time to play something like c3, but just statically, there's a lot that's wrong with my position that I don't really see a way to fix. So it's important to not play moves automatically after you've been surprised in the opening, because castles is sort of an automatic move that you just expect to make, but it's very easy to sort of slip into trouble if you're not totally familiar with the position. So with all of this in mind, I developed the knight first, which is a very subtle difference. It's not a big difference, but it might have made a big difference in the game, because I don't think I would have been very happy at all after h4. So knight to d7, my opponent has thankfully run out of useful moves and castles the king. So now this is my green light to go ahead and castle as well. Not nearly as worried about stuff like h4, h5, because I can respond to this with h5, and with the rook on h1, going to have to worry about stuff like g4. But with the king on g1, g4 does more harm than good to white's position. I'm going to be able to do things like take on h4 and get a lot of counterplay. So h4, of course, is not played by my opponent now. Instead, he chooses just c3 to help solidify this pawn. And now I need to come up with a plan to try to equalize the game. So I sort of survived the opening. I didn't, lose a pawn, didn't get my king's position wrecked, but I'm definitely not equal here. As always in the Caro-Kann, as long as your opponent has this nagging space advantage, you're going to be a little bit worse until you can do something about it. Beyond that, my opponent has managed to snag my light squared bishop and the bishop pair. So I have a lot of work to do here. So now it's time to sit back and say, okay, things didn't go perfectly, but it's not a disaster. So how am I going to equalize this game? How am I going to get my pieces involved and make sure I'm not a lot worse? So this is where it helps to be familiar with the Caro positions, but I'll give you a hint. There's two big pawn breaks you should be thinking about. Yeah, so the YouTube chat has some ideas. Any ideas here before I give away the answer? Go ahead and just shout them out if you've got them. How can we deal with this space advantage for white? Okay, of course, we need to challenge this pawn. And so I said the word pawn break. So hopefully the move c5 stuck out to some of you, and hopefully the move e5 also stuck out to some of you. These are really just the two main ways you can challenge this pawn on d4. And after something like c5, let's just pretend I'm able to do it, and white passes. If white tries to leave this pawn here, then we're going to be very happy to capture. And after pawn takes, of course, white still has a space advantage. The pawn does give him some extra space. But now it's not connected to the rest of the pawns. Now it's an isolated queen pawn, and it's something I can use to attack and target as a weakness. It's not just strictly an advantage for white. So that's why the pawn break is so good. And of course, if white were to capture after something like e5 or c5, then the space advantage is going to go away. Then neither of us have any space advantage in the center, and it's going to be a lot more even. So the question remains, which one do you think I should be going for, e5 or c5, and why? How do you sort of make this decision? in this game, it was actually a pretty easy decision for me for one big reason. There's one piece on the board that makes this decision a lot easier.
I'll do e5 because you threatened the knight and you have to respond.
Yeah, so that's one actually very, very important feature in the position. If I tried something like c5 here, my opponent is not obligated actually to take or to leave this pawn here. Actually, by pushing this pawn forward, I'm giving up a lot of control over the d5 square. And I know in this specific instance, this bishop could take on b7, but just statically, if I ever try to push c5, I might have to worry about this move d5, when actually my space disadvantage is only getting worse, right? If I try taking this guy, the white pieces might sort of spring into action, and I could be running into some trouble. So as you pointed out, e5 would not run into that issue, at least immediately, because it does gain a tempo on the knight. No time to play d5 if the knight's attacked. But beyond that, I sort of already gave it away with some of the lines. The reason why c5 doesn't make a lot of sense here is because we did have to give up our light squared bishop. This bishop is going to be a monster on this diagonal if I play something like c5 and ever allow it to just view this long open diagonal, best diagonal on the board for that bishop. And I just can't counteract it. I have no bishop to challenge with. So whenever you have sort of the bishop pair disadvantage, you're missing one of your bishops that your opponent has, you have to be very, very aware of this bishop, and you have to make sure that you're able to stunt it somehow, either with your pawns, with one of your knights, somehow, some way. You have to be able to challenge this bishop, and I just would not be able to do that after this move c5. So e5 is definitely what I was looking at. And I actually go ahead and just play it immediately. If I tried to prepare it with something like queen to c7, as you pointed out, having this attack the knight is actually really, really nice. Sort of worried that after something like knight to d3, I might not be able to achieve e5 quite as comfortably. Again, I was worried about this move c5 sort of coming, or d5 coming through in some instances. So e5 right away. My opponent actually chooses not to capture and goes knight back to e2. And here I play knight b6, which is a pretty serious mistake. I was sort of trying to be clever and keep the tension in the center of the board for a little while longer and start routing my knight to a square like d5. But it does turn out that this move does more harm than good. Of course, I should just take on d4 here. There's no reason not to. And after some exchanges, black is going to be doing just fine in this position. I can challenge this queen, either with bishop e5, maybe even bishop c5. Could even consider something like queen to f6. A lot of different options here for black to continue. Instead, though, tried to be clever and chose knight to b6. And Julian does find a nice idea here, which I did anticipate, but it's still a nice idea to be aware of. There is one way to always challenge knights on b6 or b3, and oftentimes this also happens with knights on g3 or g6, although I first learned the idea with knights on the b file like this. There's a really easy way to challenge these knights and just make them look a little bit silly. And the chat is discussing a move that is about to come up, so I will answer those questions momentarily. So at first glance, this knight seems like it's totally fine here on b6. Like I said, I'm trying to target this d5 square a little bit. But the problem is this is never really going to be a stable square. And the reason for that is white can sort of target this knight with natural space gaining moves. So in chess, it can be tough to push your pawns in the center a lot of the time. That's where all the combat is happening. But especially with Alpha 0 in the past few years, everybody loves throwing their rook pawns forward. And it turns out with the knight on b6, throwing the rook pawn forward is a very easy way to just make this knight very, very uncomfortable. Now if I don't do anything, white can and will play this move a5, and maybe even follow up with a6, when again, I have to be very, very careful not to let this bishop into the game. So a6, of course, would undermine my light squared defense here, and this bishop would start sort of cutting into the position. So a4 a nice idea. Of course, I had something in mind. I just play this move a5 to try and stop it. So what was the point of it all? Well, now this knight, of course, has no pawns defending it, so it's a little bit unsteady. And after the move takes, and now queen b3, white is able to get this nice little bit of pressure against my queen side here. Now, it's not a lot. It's not going to win the game right away, but it is a little bit uncomfortable for black. You have to be careful here not to let something slip, because if you make one big mistake and you lose this b pawn, next thing you know, the c pawn is going to fall as well, and your queen side just collapses. So slight inaccuracies from me here, and the game sort of felt like it was getting just a little bit out of hand. In the game, though, things were still going okay. I just go ahead and play this move, queen to c7. And now I actually don't love how Julian continued here. I thought for sure he was just going to try and finish development somehow, something like even bishop e3, although it looks a little bit scary with knight takes e3. But I thought he would go for like bishop g5, something like this, rook d1, just continuing to bring the pieces into the game, and eventually play for something like c4, c5 maybe. It's a little bit risky to open up this diagonal for my bishop, but again, he's going for this nice queenside counterplay, and I thought there were a lot of different ways he could do that. Maybe even knight to f4, knight to d3, knight to c5, these kinds of ideas to help target my queenside. Instead, he went for this move, bishop to h3. And here, I think, is my first super serious mistake of the game. So I did what's called believing your opponent. I believed in my opponent's idea. So in chess, whenever your opponent plays a move that you don't expect, it's always a great idea to slow down and take a moment and say, okay, I didn't expect this move. What on earth could my opponent want? Why is my opponent moving this bishop off the long diagonal and attacking my knight? So clearly, he wants my knight to move. The question is, why? Why does he want my knight to move? What's his intention? So what do you guys think? What could his intention be? Yeah, what do you think? Bishop h6. Wow, so you are more on top of things than I am. I thought he was going to go bishop e3. So I started looking at this bishop e3 idea, and I sort of became a little bit concerned. So my most natural move here, I thought, was either knight g7 or knight to d6. And the reason is, after knight g7, I went ahead for this super stable square on e6. Knights do really well on stable squares that are defended by pawns, even if they're not, on the 6th rank, trying to attack the opponent. They still do well on stable squares. They can control a large portion of the board, and especially on e6, it would be shutting down this diagonal, be threatening to hop into some pretty important squares at a moment's notice, and it would be very, very nice to have there. And same thing with knight d6. With knight d6, this is a reasonably stable square. The other knight can come to a square like d5, and my knights together are just going to control large areas of the center if I'm able to maintain this position. However, against both of these moves, I thought that my opponent was intending to go bishop to e3, and okay, I drew a lot of arrows, bishop to e3, with the point being that it's targeting my loose knight on b6. And I thought after this knight moved, this bishop might step into c5. All of a sudden, I have to move my rook, and the more I looked at it, the more I just became concerned that he was going to be able to invade on these dark squares somehow. It's going to give me a lot of trouble on the dark squares, maybe even like knight c1 to d3, and these dark squares are sort of falling to my opponent's control. Now, it turns out that this stuff is pretty okay for black. It turns out I was sort of seeing ghosts with these ideas on the dark squares. This bishop is actually a little bit vulnerable. Something like knight to e6 would immediately target it, for example. And black is doing fine here. So instead of this, I came up with this weird-looking move, knight e7. Now, the reason for this is I wanted to respond to bishop e3 with knight e to d5. And I felt like this was the way for me to continue to keep all my dark squares under control. My knight can now help defend b6, target this bishop on e3, And after something like this, rook e8, I'm immediately going to go with knight to d7, and this bishop is actually running out of squares. So I did play this move, knight to e7, but as you pointed out, bishop h6 is also a very reasonable idea, and that is actually what Julian ends up playing. And because of these ideas, because I believed my opponent, I put my knight on pretty much an objectively worse square. And that gives Julian an opportunity here to sort of take the lead once again. Now, it turns out that bishop h6 actually isn't the way to do it. As I've been saying, there is this really tempting knight rerouting maneuver, and this is the way for white to play for an edge. Something like knight d5, for example, knight d3, bishop g7, knight c5. Turns out this knight is just very, very strong on this square, and it's going to give black some problems. Difficult to challenge this piece very effectively. You also don't have to play knight c5 right away. You can do some other things. c4, c5 is also in the air. Lots of ideas for white. But instead, bishop h6, rook e8, and rook to e1. So not all is lost. My pieces are just a little bit awkward, and I do an okay job of repositioning. I do bring this knight out to d5. We see this knight come to d4. I simply retreat back to f6. I'm anticipating knight f3. We do see knight f3. And then I finally play this move, knight to d7. So slowly but surely, I'm reorganizing my pieces to more active squares. I have this knight on a nice stable square on d5, and things seem to be coming back into my control. Rook to d1 is played, and then I very concretely go, okay, first I go rook e7, then after queen to a3, here very concretely I can simplify the position just a little bit. So I do that with this move knight to e5, which again is still totally fine. We get a trade. By the way, I'm making a threat. Don't hang your bishops. My opponent doesn't. I go queen h5, and now bishop to d2. And at this moment, I felt like the tide was sort of turning. My opponent just had to retreat for 2 moves in a row. I got rid of one of my annoying knights. My remaining knight is on this nice d5 square where it's reasonably stable. Of course, I have to be worried about c4 in some instances, but I've got control over this open file. My queen is active, my bishop is active, my knight's on a good square. I felt like things were sort of turning in my direction. And this is where I make the losing move. And this is why I chose to go over this game here, because it's the sort of move that's like so dumb. It's like, what am I going to learn from this super simple mistake? The answer is just don't play stupid mistakes that blunder your pieces. But there is something I think to take away from here. So the move I played in the game is rook to e2. Now let's see if you guys are good enough to beat me at chess here. I get the feeling some of you are, maybe all of you. What is the problem with rook to e2? And don't feel bad if you can't find it here, because this was a 90 plus 30 game. You've got like 45 minutes to figure out how to beat me. Now, you don't have 45 minutes here tonight, but if we were playing a game, you certainly would. Yeah, I wasn't so worried about this. I think I can always extract the rook somehow. Yeah, Brian?
C4 followed by bishop f3.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So in the game, I obviously noticed that I was like, hey, if bishop f3 ever happens, I'm in big trouble. And then I swear to you, I thought to myself, thankfully, there's no bishop f3 tactics here. I'm playing rook e2. Of course, there's a bishop f3 tactic here, as Brian pointed out. This sneaky, sneaky queen on a3 that I thought I had banished to the queen's side that was never going to give me problems again, of course, does control laterally the f3 square after this move c4. And with that, black is dead lost. There's just nothing to do here. There's no way to save all your pieces. And I'll show you what happens in a moment. But I do go on to lose the game, of course. So what's the deal? How do you, take anything away from, blundering a two-move tactic in your game? Well, the important thing is to be brutally honest with yourself. It's very, very easy to write off one or two move blunders as, an unavoidable fact of chess. You're always going to blunder sometimes. Nobody is immune to blunders, certainly not me. And if you follow professional tournaments, every once in a blue moon, you'll see them blunder something similar. Everybody is capable of missing a two-move tactic. But oftentimes, you can trace it back to a mistake in your thinking process. So the more I thought about this game, the more I realized that I had a pretty big mistake in my thinking process. I was sort of playing with the momentum of the game. You start feeling good, your opponent's pieces are heading backwards, your pieces are heading forwards, and I got into kind of a rhythm. I was like, okay, things are going well for me. I'm going to keep going forward, try to invade, try and start getting an advantage with moves like rook to e2. Start trying to make some threats against the king and start taking the initiative. And that's something you really do have to look out for. It's easy to get caught up in the game. When things seem to be going well, I find myself oftentimes speeding up. I played rook e2 reasonably quickly, and getting a little bit over-optimistic is what I've noticed. So that is the big mistake that I'm taking away. Not that I hung a two-move tactic. Nobody's immune to two-move tactics. But the mistake is in my thinking process. You want to be careful. You've got to be diligent. You cannot be lazy at the board. You have to ensure that your moves are safe. So that is the big valuable lesson to take away from this game. Which again, I'm going to show you the rest. You get to see how Julian crushed me. But that's the point I'm trying to get across. Even from the stupidest mistakes, two-move tactics, one-move blunders, there is something to learn. And oftentimes it is in self-evaluating your thinking process, saying, okay, why did I end up blundering here? Was it actually just, random chance my time was up to make a big blunder? Or is there something I should be doing differently at the board? Some other way I should be thinking at the board. And that's the sort of self-reflection that you really need if you want to cut down on these blunders, cut down on these mistakes. You have to be looking at them, have to be trying to understand where they're coming from, why they're happening. Okay, so rook e2, c4, and then points to anybody in the chat if you actually came up with the move rook takes f2 before you played the move c4. Because I'm not going to go down without a fight. I'm going to go down swinging. So rook takes f2. Hopefully you were all well prepared for this and saw everything far in advance, how to refute rook takes f2. So you're not done yet. I haven't resigned yet. You still have work to do to beat me at this chess game. So what can you come up with here against rook f2? Of course, what's the point if rook takes f2? What's my idea? No, stronger than that. This rook was important here on f1. Yeah, queen takes rook is in the position. So no, I'm not without ideas. Not without ideas. Mr. E in the chat says bishop f3 anyways, which loses to checkmates. All right, I'm 2-0 so far. 2-0.
Did you take the rook with the king?
So king takes rook is going to be really, really scary. Now what might I do? Now, so my queen is nice here. I can sort of get him in a crisscross. You guys know the crisscross pattern? This is my friend Chris, and this is my friend Cross. And this king is running out of squares, right? Bishop e3, I can take it, and still supported by my knight. King to e1, you might actually be checkmated here. Might actually be checkmated here. So you guys are eventually, by the process of elimination, I think going to arrive at the move here. And oftentimes, this is a great defensive resource. When your opponent is attacking, if you can remove one of the attacking pieces, sometimes the attack is not so scary anymore. So with that hint, what comes to mind? Yeah, you just take the knight with the pawn. The sort of the most natural move does turn out to be correct here. And now, without this knight, I do not have the necessary forces to control the e3 square, and I'm running out of ideas. I do still have some ideas, though. I come out with bishop to d4. And after bishop to e3, I do have this nice little tactic, rook takes g2, and queen to e2 with check. Again, you cannot block with the rook, because I'll capture your other rook. And after bishop to f2, I do have bishop takes f2, bishop takes f2, and if you go rook takes f2, I'm actually winning with queen takes d1 again. But Julian comes up with this nice move, queen to f3. And queen f3 wins, queen d3 wins, even queen b3 wins. But he chooses queen f3. So he navigates the few complications that I was able to throw at him. And we end up simplifying into this endgame, which is going to be actually pretty easily winning for white. You might expect that black can put up somewhat of a fight here, but with good play, white is just going to be winning. So there's one more important move to play here before I call it quits on this game and just say Julian did the rest with ease. So what do you play here with white to firmly secure your advantage? There's a couple options. Yep, that's exactly right. D6 here. So when you're pushing for the win, oftentimes it's incorrect to trade pawns. And especially when you have a strong pawn that is passed, it's a good idea to push it. I'm not the first person to say this. So D6 is now just securing a totally winning advantage for white. And of course, I fought on for a long, long time. The game went something like this. And then after G4, I stopped putting the game into this Lee chess study because I was very unhappy. But what's the winning idea for white here? Well, of course, this rook is doing a great job of pinning down the black rook to d8. This rook is not going to be able to move, otherwise queens is going to be strong. This rook prevents my king from helping out. And so all white needs to do now is force a weakness on the king side, which he does by pushing these pawns. Then this rook can start invading over here. The king can start invading as well. King f4, king g5 ideas. And that's exactly what happens in the game. Just to show some moves, something like this ended up happening, I think. Let's see here. I actually think I played this very, very silly move, h6, h5, g5. And now, now this king made its way in to f5, for example. And things went downhill from here. I tried something like b5. And I nearly swindled him, but was unable to. So from here, hopefully you can see rook e6, and black's position is becoming pretty hopeless pretty quickly. So that's that game. I would say it was my worst game in the tournament, but not necessarily because of just this one blunder, rook to e2. I think it's my worst game of the tournament because of these mistakes in my thinking process. That's something you can correct. You can't totally eliminate two-move blunders, one-move blunders from your games, but you can correct your thinking process, and that's the takeaway. When you play your worst games, it's still very important to look at them and try and understand where these mistakes are coming from. Oftentimes, it's not just out of thin air. There's a reason that you're making mistakes. So we spent a lot of time on this game, but do you guys have any questions for me? That was a lot to cover, a lot to talk about. So any questions on this game, the Caro-Kann, this line in particular? What do you guys have for me? Nothing. I love it. All right, well, let me do a quick review then, and then I want to show you at least the start of one other game. So how did we get here? We played the Caro-Kann. Once again, my opponent surprised me with this move, knight g to h5. I think I actually responded pretty well to the surprise. Keeping things simple, keeping my position solid was a good idea. Developing out, avoiding castling until my opponent does, paying close attention in the opening when you get surprised. Then this e5 break is my attempt to equalize. Knight b6 is a little bit inaccurate. Better just, again, to keep things simple, make sure I'm equalizing. And then after this, my next mistake, believing my opponent too much. Worried about bishop e3, I should just play the natural moves, either knight g7 or knight d6. Then after this, I play like a genius. I'm able to, I think, almost fully equalize with these ideas, and then blunder it all away with rook e2, because I got a little bit too careless. Felt a little bit too confident in my position. Had to stay vigilant, had to make sure I didn't blunder. And then the rest of the game is the rest of the game. Mr. E asks, how did I place in the tourney? I won the tourney, as you would know if you followed, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago. I'm not sure. Lost track of time. Okay. With that, I want to show you the start of a game that I won, which I forgot to put the names in. But this is my game against Arjun Puri, who is a very, very strong young kid in St. Louis, who I think now gained like 70 rating points in this tournament. He's around 2070 rated. I'm sure he will be crushing me before too long. But in this game, I had the white pieces against him. I start out with d4, d5, c4, c6. I take, he takes. And I choose this move, knight to c3. Now, Arjun is a very hardworking kid, and I think he was, at the time, taking lessons with Julian, who, again, knows my entire repertoire. So I'm in trouble. Normally, I play this move bishop f4, but I knew that Arjun knew that. So, in classic Princess Bride style, I deviated first, played this move knight to c3. Because I knew that he knew, but then that he knew that I knew that he knew, and then, all right, knight c3. And Arjun immediately messes up the move order, which is a weakness I sort of noticed in Arjun's opening play. I don't think he has his move orders quite correct here. So he chooses knight to c6. The better move here for black is simply knight to f6. Now, the reason for that is knight to c6 does not defend the e4 square. And this move e4 can get pretty tricky for black if you're not familiar with it. So I go e4. Arjun plays d takes e4. I go d5, knight e5. I had seen all this beforehand. Queen a4 check, takes on e4, and takes on g6. So far, so good. I had looked at this all beforehand, and I knew that this was like +2 for white. I was like, this position is great. I'm very, very close to winning already. This could not have gone better. However, I did not know the next move because, you have to economize your time when you're prepping for a tournament. You don't want to spend all your time looking at the winning positions in case they actually play the good moves. But in this case, Arjun unfortunately fell into this opening trap, and I just have a very, very good position here. And already, this is my first mistake of the game. So put yourself in my shoes here. You know you have a very good position. Your position should be very, very strong. And so what do? You know your position is good. You just don't know which move it is to win. What are you thinking about when you find yourself in that spot?
This is from Master Lab, right?
Yes. Okay. What to do? And you can either give me a move or even just sort of a way of thinking. We're talking about fixing our thinking process tonight, looking at our bad games to try and do that. So should I try to kill the guy? Should I just try to win out of the opening? I'm +2. You've made too many mistakes. Now's my time. Or should I maybe keep it simpler? What do you think? Yeah. So I think that this was my mistake. I thought that my position was so good, and I found a very, very tempting move. And I thought maybe this move is the reason why black's position is so bad, and I can just kind of win directly. But as always, simple chess is oftentimes the best chess. And developing normally would have been really, really great here. So knight to f3 is what the chat was suggesting, which is a totally fine move. But there is actually another way to develop that makes black's life a little bit harder. So I'm looking at this bishop in particular. This bishop's undeveloped, and I can keep it undeveloped if I play one correct move here. So with that in mind, what do you think is the right way to go? Bishop g5? Okay, so not necessarily, although this move does certainly look interesting. So bishop g5, the point is you're targeting this e-pawn. You're trying to make it so this e-pawn can't move, and this bishop has to stay on f8. But in this instance, I think knight f6 is going to be a very natural move for black. And if you take, I think I am not too unhappy about actually playing g takes when I'm going to develop to g7 and at least get castled. Now, I'm not saying black is doing well here, but black is at least, you know, making it out of the opening, getting the pieces in the game. And of course, if you move the queen, up to you what square. To be honest, I'm not sure. Maybe to e3. Now e6 I do think would be getting played. And not to say that this is ideal. I think I'm probably taking this with the f pawn and playing bishop e7. Of course, white's going to be a little bit better, but white can play even stronger in this position. There's an even more concrete way to keep this pawn from moving. That's exactly right. Just bishop c4. You develop a piece, you get your king closer to castling, and you stop e6. It does everything you could ever want in a chess move. If you play e6 now, I'm simply just attacking this guy too many times. There's no tricks because I can just save my bishop, and you have lost. Same thing here. I can even take this with check now. Free pawn for white, lead in development, clearly winning. So bishop c4 would have been really good. Now, the chat room has been shouting out knight b4, which is highly illegal, but knight b5 is what I played in the game. So, you know, I got drawn into the thrill of it. You know, I'm threatening checkmate on like move 9. This is great. And I thought that this might be why my opponent's position was so bad. And I actually played knight b5 fairly quickly. And if you're noticing a theme, when I think things are going well, I seem to play very aggressive moves and not put quite enough thought into them. So remember that last game that I played against Julian that went horribly for me? Maybe if I had looked at that game earlier, before my game against Arjun, I would have thought to slow down a little bit, keep things a little bit more simple, and be a little bit more cautious. Even though things are going well, have to be cautious. I think that's the takeaway for me from this tournament, from my worst games at least. So I go knight b5. My opponent now plays e6 with impunity. I take on e6. We see bishop takes e6. I think f takes e6 is supposed to be marginally better, but it's all okay. And now I look and I look and I look. I look at this move. I look at, you know, stupid moves, and I can't find a win. So I play bishop to d2, which turns out to be a totally fine move. And now my opponent does give me another chance. Turns out bishop c5, I think, is the best way for black to continue. Just get these pieces in the game, get developed as soon as you can, and you will survive the opening. Instead, he chose this move queen to e7, which is a very concrete move. It's trying to get the queens off the board, say, I see how your pieces are lined up. If I can get a queen trade, I'm going to be able to develop. I'm going to make it out of the opening. But this move loses immediately. So we've got a few minutes. See if you can find out how to just immediately win the game. I was unable to find it in the game, of course. And just to give you some idea of how winning it is, I think the engine reads something like +10 here. So it's pretty good. It's pretty good for white. Pretty strong position. The chat says bishop c4. This one actually loses a piece. Your queen is pinned. Actually, I guess you have knight d6 there, but then king d7. Yeah, I don't know. Bishop c4 is kind of weird, but not the idea. And James in the chat does have the idea, but we'll give people a little bit longer to think about it. Wow, James just putting me to shame. Just finding it in like 30 seconds. I couldn't find it over the board. Shameful. Shameful.
The knight to check on him.
Which one?
Sorry. Oh, yeah, good question.
Yeah, it is a good question. That's what I was thinking in the game. It's like, where do I put this piece?
Initially,
C7?
Now you may rethink it, yeah.
Yeah, now maybe d6. Yeah, so this is the trap that I fell into in the game. I was like, oh, knight c7 is so, so tempting. I want to get this knight out. I want to bring this bishop in. I want to bring my other bishop in, bring my rook in. I want to checkmate the guy. This is my plan. And I got so enamored with knight to c7 that I sat there. I spent like, I think 10 minutes or so just like thinking, knight c7, knight c7, knight c7, knight c7. And I got stuck thinking of all these lines. And it turns out knight c7 doesn't work. And I came to that conclusion in the game. Knight c7, black is just going to take this piece. You go bishop b5 check. I think black just runs in this direction. And I just didn't see the follow-up here. I didn't see how you were supposed to get from this to a winning position. For example, something like this, knight f6, rook d1. Okay, I was going to say king here, but now I'm realizing that this might happen. Is that working for white? All right, we're going to cheat because time is low. Bishop g5, knight f6, rook d1, king c8 is enough, or just bishop to d6. Okay, and we are somehow, some way having all of our pieces into the game and protecting the king. It's like -6 here, says Stockfish, so I'm not totally crazy. So knight c7, no good. And so eventually, I came to my senses. I was like, all right, knight c7's no good. I'm going to develop my pieces and play rook c1. Now, of course, knight to d6 is just completely winning. What's the difference? The difference is that after king to d8, the queen is not defending the a5 square, and bishop a5 check is just entirely winning. You can't even block with b6 because your rook on a8 hangs with check. If you come this way, simplest is rook to d1, when rook to d8 is a tough threat to stop. Very, very tough. And knight d6 just wins on the spot. So again, you can chalk it up to, okay, sometimes you miss the tactic, but again, it's a mistake in the thinking process. You have to make sure you're calculating effectively and efficiently. Don't spend all your time, on one move and then just give up. When something doesn't feel like it's working, it's worth it to take a step back, go back to the start and say, is there, something easier here? But instead, I miss it. I go rook to c1. My opponent plays knight to f6. And again, I just missed a two-move tactic here. And this is one of those times where I honestly could not tell you what the mistake in the thinking process was, because I was staring at this move, knight to c7. I was staring at this move, queen to c7 in my brain. And I was just like, there's nothing to do here. There's no way to do it. I just can't do it. This just doesn't work. When obviously, queen takes e6 with check is just getting a big advantage for white. If you take, I take. If you block, I check, and you run into a lot of the same problems. And here, white is just going to be significantly better with the rook invading. Now, for whatever reason, I couldn't find that. I brought my queen back to e2, and then Arjun played like a genius, because he is one. Played all the best moves, all the best moves by Arjun. Knight g5, all the best moves by Arjun. Knight to e7, knight f3, castles, g6, and up to g6, Arjun has seriously been playing like a genius. And here, I actually would have been worse if he found this move bishop to f5. Now all of a sudden, these bishops are raking down the board. My rook on c1 is actually a little bit awkwardly placed to do something to protect my pawn. And bishop b2, I'm sort of running out of squares here. It's not so comfortable for me in this position in particular. So from +10 to slightly worse in a matter of a few moves there. So again, not so good. Now, I did end up winning this game, but only because Arjun made a one-move mistake, which it's up to him to determine his thinking process. Up to this point, again, he's been playing very, very well. Then he just randomly plays this move king to f8, which of course allows white to take the advantage after knight h7, king g7, knight f6, when black loses, I think, the most important piece on the board in exchange for the knight. Now things just collapse from here. Knight takes f6 is a big mistake, bishop b2, and there's just no way to escape from this pin. Knight g8, knight g5, he does escape, but it costs him a pawn. And now my bishop pair is going to go ahead and win the game. And the rest of the game is not so eventful. I do go on to win here. Eventually, I trade down into this endgame. And then he offers to go into this endgame, which for the first time in my life, I actually did calculate correctly, even better than the lead chess computer, which calls this a blunder, because this king and pawn endgame is just winning. And if you give the engine long enough, it'll find it as well. So if you want to, that's your homework. Solve this king and pawn endgame. Why is it winning? How is it winning? But unfortunately, we are out of time for tonight. We do have the wonderful Katerina Nemkova coming in directly after me. Make sure you stick around for that. It's going to be a great lecture. And I want to thank you all very much for joining me here tonight. So as always, my name is Caleb Denby. This has been the Road to 2000, and I will see you guys next time.